The Willie Kimani case. Every case leaves a trace. Welcome to Hidden Trace, the lawyer who went to court and never came home. The night 3 men disappeared on June 23, 2016. 3 men left a court in Kenya. One was a lawyer, one was his client, and the third was a taxi driver who had been doing nothing more than taking people where they needed to go. Their names were Willie Kimani, Josephat Mwenda, and Joseph Muiruri. They were expected to return home. They never did. At first, their disappearance raised questions. Where were they? Why had they vanished together? And what had happened after they left court? The answers would eventually lead investigators to one of the most disturbing murder cases in modern Kenyan history. But this story did not begin with 3 bodies being discovered. It began with a lawyer who had taken on a case involving a client who said he had been mistreated by police, and that detail would become crucial to everything that followed. This is the story of Willie Kimani, a lawyer who chose to represent a vulnerable client, a client who had challenged the conduct of a police officer, and a taxi driver who happened to be with them on the night they disappeared. What happened next would expose allegations of police abuse, trigger public outrage, and ultimately result in murder convictions. But to understand how the tragedy unfolded, we have to go back to the beginning.
The lawyer and his client. Willie Kimani was not simply a lawyer appearing in court for another routine case. According to Kenya's court records, Kimani was an advocate working with International Justice Mission, an organization involved in providing legal assistance to vulnerable people. The court described him as someone who had devoted himself to helping people who could not easily afford legal representation. That work brought him into contact with Josephat Mwenda. Mwenda had become involved in a legal dispute after an encounter with police. According to the court record, Mwenda had alleged that Senior Sergeant Frederick O. Lellerman had shot and injured him in April 2015. The circumstances surrounding that incident would become extremely important. Mwenda subsequently sought legal assistance and made a complaint concerning the police officer. Kimani became his lawyer. At this point, there was no reason to believe that representing a client in court would cost a lawyer his life. For Kimani, it was part of his work. For Mwenda, it was an attempt to seek justice. But according to later court findings, tensions surrounding Mwenda's complaint would become part of the background to the events that followed. The legal battle continued. Then came June 2016. Kimani and Mwenda attended court. They were accompanied by Joseph Muiruri, a taxi driver, and when the day's proceedings were over, the 3 men left. That would be the last time their families would know where they were. They disappeared. At first, their loved ones had questions, then came fear, and eventually, an urgent search began. The Law Society of Kenya would later approach the High Court seeking orders concerning the missing men. The situation had become so serious that the court was asked to compel authorities to produce them. The case was no longer simply about 3 people who could not be reached. There was growing concern that something terrible had happened. And then came the discovery that changed the investigation completely. Bodies believed to be those of Willie Kimani, Josephat Mwenda, and Joseph Muiruri were found at the Oldonyo Sabuk River. The 3 men who had left court had not simply disappeared, they had been murdered. And suddenly, the question facing investigators became much bigger. The investigation would eventually lead back toward the police officers connected to the earlier dispute involving Mwenda, and what investigators uncovered would turn a disappearance into a national scandal. But before we get there, we need to understand the last known movements of the 3 men, and the chain of events that led investigators toward their alleged killers. The last journey. By June 2016, Josephat Mwenda's legal battle had already become more than an ordinary court case. He had complained about the conduct of a police officer, and Willie Kimani was representing him. That meant the courtroom was where the dispute was supposed to be settled. On the day the three men disappeared, Kimani was at Mavoko Law Courts with Mwenda. Joseph Muiruri, a taxi driver, was also with them. What happened after they left the courthouse would become one of the most important parts of the investigation. According to accounts documented shortly after their disappearance, the three men were abducted as they left the court premises. At first, however, their families did not know that they had been abducted. They simply knew that the men had not come home. And as the hours passed, the concern became more serious. A missing person can sometimes be explained by something completely ordinary. A delayed journey, a dead phone, an unexpected change of plans. But when three people disappear together, the questions become much harder to ignore. Where had they gone? Who had last seen them? And why had all three disappeared at the same time? The concern surrounding the men quickly reached beyond their families. The Law Society of Kenya became involved and went to court, seeking orders concerning their disappearance. The case was described before the High Court as involving the mysterious and enforced disappearance of Willie Kimani, Josephat Mwenda, and Joseph Muiruri. Then investigators began looking more closely at what had happened around the time the men vanished. One particularly disturbing allegation emerged. Human rights organizations reported that the men had been taken into police custody after leaving court. The Kenya Human Rights Commission stated at the time that they had been abducted by administration police officers and connected the disappearance to Mwenda's complaint against a senior police officer. That allegation changed the nature of the investigation. This was no longer simply a case of three people who could not be located. There were now serious questions about whether people entrusted with enforcing the law had been involved. The pressure on authorities grew. Families wanted answers. Lawyers demanded answers. Human rights organizations demanded answers, and the country began watching. Then, several days after the disappearance, the investigation took a devastating turn. The bodies of Willie Kimani, Josephat Mwenda, and Joseph Muiruri were discovered near the Old Donyo Sabuk River. Three men who had left court were dead. Their disappearance had become a triple murder investigation, and investigators now had a much more difficult question to answer. Who had taken them, and what had happened between the moment they left court and the moment their bodies were discovered? The investigation would eventually focus on police officers and another individual, but before the courtroom would hear the evidence against them, investigators had to reconstruct the final hours of three men whose families had been waiting for them to come home. And that reconstruction would reveal a disturbing chain of events, a chain that began at a courthouse, moved through police custody, and ended beside a river. The search for three missing men, for the families of Willie Kimani, Josephat Mwenda, and Joseph Muiruri. The first days after their disappearance must have been filled with one question. Where were they? Three men had left court. Then they seemed to disappear. But this was not a disappearance that investigators could simply ignore. The circumstances were deeply troubling. Willie Kimani was a lawyer, Josephat Mwenda was his client, and Joseph Muiruri was a taxi driver who'd been with them. Their disappearance soon attracted the attention of lawyers, human rights organizations, and the wider public. The Law Society of Kenya went to court seeking intervention over the missing men. The pressure was growing, families wanted answers, and authorities were now under increasing scrutiny. But as investigators tried to reconstruct what had happened, attention increasingly turned toward the circumstances surrounding Mwenda's legal dispute. Mwenda had been pursuing a complaint against police officer Frederick Leleman. Kimani was representing him. That connection would later become central to the prosecution's case. But at this stage, the most urgent question was much simpler. What had happened to the three men after they left court? A disturbing trail. As the search continued, investigators began examining movements, witnesses, and possible locations connected to the disappearance. The case was no longer being treated as an ordinary missing person investigation. The possibility that the men had been forcibly taken was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. And then came the discovery that transformed the case. The bodies of Willie Kimani, Josephat Mwenda, and Joseph Muiruri were found at the Oldonyo Sabuk River. The three men who had disappeared after their court appearance were dead. For their families, the search had ended in the worst possible way. For investigators, however, the discovery marked the beginning of an even more difficult task. They now had to determine how three people had gone from leaving court alive to being found dead days later. Who had taken them? Who had last seen them? Where had they been held? And what had happened between their disappearance and the discovery of their bodies? The investigation would eventually focus on several people, including police officers, but accusations alone were not enough. The prosecution would have to prove its case in court, and that meant reconstructing the events surrounding the men's final hours, the case that would not go away. The murders generated widespread outrage in Kenya. Lawyers and human rights defenders protested and demanded accountability. The case became a symbol of concerns about police brutality and extrajudicial killings. But behind all the public attention were three individual lives. Willie Kimani had been doing his job. Josephat Mwenda had been seeking legal redress. Joseph Muiruri had been a taxi driver. Their families were left to live with a loss that could never be reversed. And the country was left with another question. Could the justice system hold those responsible accountable? That question would take years to answer. The investigation eventually led to a criminal trial, and inside that courtroom, prosecutors would present evidence intended to reconstruct what happened to the three men. The accused would have their opportunity to challenge that evidence. Witnesses would testify, the court would examine the evidence, and eventually a judge would have to decide whether the prosecution had proved the charges beyond reasonable doubt. But before we reach that courtroom, we need to look at the evidence that investigators said connected the accused to the final movements of the three victims. Because the question was no longer simply, where did they go? It had become, who was responsible? And that is where the investigation became even more disturbing. The search for Willie Kimani, Josephat Mwenda, and Joseph Muiruri had gone on for days. Their families were waiting for answers. Investigators were trying to establish where the three men had gone after leaving court, and across Kenya, concern was growing. Then the search reached the Oldonyo Sabuk area. What investigators discovered there would bring the disappearance to a devastating end. The bodies of Willie Kimani, Josephat Mwenda, and Joseph Muiruri were found near the Oldonyo Sabuk River. The three men were dead. The news was devastating. A case that had begun as a disappearance had now become a murder investigation. And the discovery raised a series of questions that investigators urgently needed to answer. How had the men ended up there? Where had they been before they were killed? Who had taken them? And perhaps most importantly, finding the bodies gave investigators something they had not had before: physical evidence. The investigation could now focus on reconstructing the final movements of the victims. Investigators examined the circumstances surrounding the disappearance and the discovery of the bodies. Attention also returned to Josephat Mwenda's earlier dispute with police. Mwenda had been pursuing a complaint against Frederick Lellerman, the police officer he accused of shooting and injuring him. Willie Kimani had represented Mwenda in that matter. That connection would later become one of the central elements of the prosecution's case. But investigators still had to establish exactly what happened. It was not enough to know that Kimani had represented Mwenda. It was not enough to know that Mwenda had made a complaint. And it was not enough to suspect that people connected to the police might have been involved. The evidence would have to connect individuals to the murders. That distinction would become extremely important when the case eventually reached court. As news of the deaths spread, the case generated enormous public anger. Lawyers, human rights organizations, and ordinary Kenyans demanded accountability. The deaths raised broader concerns about the safety of people who challenge alleged police misconduct. For many observers, Willie Kimani's death was particularly disturbing because he was a lawyer working within the justice system. He had gone to court to represent a client, his client disappeared with him, and a taxi driver who had been transporting them also became a victim. The case therefore became much bigger than the deaths of 3 men. It became a test of whether the justice system could investigate allegations involving its own officers. Could the police investigate police? Could prosecutors build a case strong enough to withstand scrutiny? And could the courts ultimately determine who was responsible? The people who would stand trial. Eventually, several people were charged in connection with the murders. Among them was Frederick Leliman. Other accused individuals included police officer Stephen Sheburet, Sylvia Wanjiku, and Peter Ngugi. Another former police officer, Leonard Mwangi, was also charged. But being accused was not the same thing as being guilty. That distinction would remain essential throughout the proceedings. The accused would face a lengthy legal process. Prosecutors would present their evidence. Defense lawyers would challenge it. Witnesses would testify, and the court would examine the competing accounts before reaching its conclusions. The trial would take years, but when judgment eventually came, it would bring a measure of accountability for the families of the 3 victims. In 2023, the High Court convicted 4 of the accused. Frederick Leliman was sentenced to death. Stephen Sheburet received a 30-year prison sentence. Sylvia Wanjiku received 24 years. Peter Ngugi received 20 years. Leonard Mwangi was acquitted. Those outcomes marked the end of one of Kenya's most closely watched murder trials. But they did not erase what had happened. They could not return Willie Kimani to his family. They could not return Josephat Mwenda to his loved ones. And they could not return Joseph Muiruri to his family. Chapter 5. Inside the Trial. The discovery of the 3 bodies had answered one question. Willie Kimani, Josephat Mwenda, and Joseph Muiruri were dead, but another question remained. Who was responsible? That question would eventually be taken into the courtroom. The criminal case against the accused became a lengthy legal had to go beyond public outrage. The court could not convict simply because the case had attracted national attention. It had to examine the evidence. It had to consider contradictions. It had to evaluate witness credibility. And ultimately, it had to decide whether the prosecution had met the required legal standard. Years of waiting for the families of the victims. The trial was also a long period of waiting. The murders had already taken their loved ones. Now the legal process stretched across years. Every hearing brought another reminder of what had happened, but the families continued waiting for a final answer. The case had also become a symbol beyond the individual victims. For many Kenyans, it represented a fundamental question about accountability. If people entrusted with enforcing the law were accused of committing serious crimes, could the justice system hold them accountable? The answer would eventually come from the court. The verdict, after years of proceedings, judgment finally arrived. In 2023, the High Court found 4 of the accused guilty. Frederick Leliman was convicted and sentenced to death. Stephen Sheburet was sentenced to 30 years in prison. Sylvia Wanjiku received a 24-year sentence. Peter Ngugi received a 20-year sentence. Leonard Mwangi was acquitted. The verdicts represented a major moment in a case that had begun with 3 men simply failing to return home. But the judgment also demonstrated something important about criminal justice. The outcome was not determined by social media outrage. It was determined through a legal process in which evidence was presented, challenged and assessed by the court. 4 people were ultimately held criminally responsible. 1 was acquitted. And for the families who had waited years for justice, the verdicts brought an end to one part of a painful journey. But there was still another story to tell. Because the Willie Kimani case was not only about a murder investigation and a courtroom, it became a story about human rights, police accountability, and the dangers faced by people who challenge abuse of power. And that legacy would continue long after the courtroom doors closed. What the verdict could do was answer one of the questions that had haunted the case for years. Would anyone be held responsible? The answer ultimately was yes, but to understand how the court reached that conclusion, we have to go inside the trial itself, because the evidence presented in that courtroom would become the foundation for the final, after years of investigation and courtroom proceedings. The Willie Kimani case finally reached a decisive moment. The court had heard the evidence. The accused had been given an opportunity to defend themselves, and the judge had to determine who, if anyone, could legally be held responsible for the deaths of Willie Kimani, Josephat Mwenda, and Joseph Muiruri. The final judgment did not produce a single outcome for everyone who had been charged. 4 people were convicted, 1 person was acquitted. That distinction matters. A criminal trial is not simply about deciding whether something terrible happened. Everyone already knew that 3 men had lost their lives. The court had to determine whether the evidence established the individual criminal responsibility of each accused person. 4 convictions. Frederick Lelliman was found guilty and sentenced to death. Stephen Sheburet received a 30-year prison sentence. Sylvia Wanjiku was sentenced to 24 years in prison. Peter Ngugi received a 20-year prison sentence. Leonard Mwangi, however, was acquitted. For the families of the victims, the verdicts brought an end to years of uncertainty surrounding the criminal proceedings. But a courtroom judgment cannot undo a tragedy. Willie Kimani was still gone. Josephat Mwenda was still gone. Joseph Muiruri was still gone. The people who loved them still had to live with those losses. More than a murder case. The significance of the case extended beyond the individual convictions. Willie Kimani had been a lawyer. He had been representing a client who had raised allegations against a police officer, and the case ultimately involved allegations of abuse of power by members of the police. That combination made the case especially significant for Kenya's human rights community. The case demonstrated why accountability mechanisms matter. When allegations involve powerful institutions, the justice system has to be capable of examining those allegations independently. And when people are accused of serious crimes, they must still receive due process. Those 2 principles have to exist together. Accountability without due process can become injustice, and due process without accountability can become meaningless. The Willie Kimani case placed both principles under intense public scrutiny. The 3 people at the center of the story. It is easy, when telling a crime story, to focus entirely on suspects, police investigations, and courtroom drama. But the most important people in this story were the 3 men who lost their lives. Willie Kimani was a lawyer. Josephat Mwenda was a client seeking legal redress. Joseph Muiruri was a taxi driver. Their lives were more than the circumstances of their deaths. They had families, they had friends, they had hopes and plans, and they were expected to return home. They never did. That is why the story should not end with the names of the convicted men. It should end by remembering the people whose lives were taken. A case that changed the conversation. The Willie Kimani case became one of the most prominent examples in Kenya of the consequences that can follow when allegations of police abuse are not treated lightly. The case generated national outrage and international attention. It also demonstrated that investigations involving state officials can eventually reach a courtroom and result in convictions. But it also left an enduring reminder. The justice system cannot bring victims back. It can only determine responsibility through the evidence available to it. And for families who have lost someone, even a conviction may never feel like a complete ending. The question that remains. For years, one question had followed this case. Would there ever be justice for Willie, Josephat, and Joseph? The court ultimately answered that question through its verdicts. 4 people were convicted, 1 was acquitted. But perhaps the deeper question is one that extends far beyond this particular case. What happens when the people trusted to protect citizens are themselves accused of violating the law? That is the question that gives the Willie Kimani story significance beyond the courtroom, and it is why this case continues to be remembered. The legacy of 3 lives. A crime story can end with a verdict, but a tragedy does not necessarily end when the judge leaves the courtroom. For the families of Willie Kimani, Josephat Mwenda, and Joseph Muiruri, the consequences of what happened continued long after the investigation and trial. 3 lives had been lost, 3 families had been changed forever, and an entire country had been forced to confront difficult questions about justice, police accountability, and the protection of ordinary citizens. Willie Kimani. Willie Kimani was remembered not simply as a victim of a terrible crime, but as a lawyer who had been doing his job. He was representing a client. He was working within the legal system, and his death became a powerful reminder of the risks that lawyers and human rights defenders can face when they challenge alleged abuses of power. His name would become associated with the demand for accountability. Josephat Mwenda. Josephat Mwenda's story was different, but equally important. He had sought legal assistance after alleging that he had been shot and injured by a police officer. His attempt to pursue justice brought him into contact with Willie Kimani. The 2 men became connected through the legal process, but that connection ultimately ended in tragedy. His case raises a painful question. What happens when someone believes they have been wronged by the very institution responsible for protecting them? For Mwenda, the answer was devastating. Joseph Muiruri, and then there was Joseph Muiruri. Unlike Kimani and Mwenda, he was not at the center of the original legal dispute. He was a taxi driver. He happened to be involved in the journey, and he became the 3rd victim. His death is an important reminder that violence can extend far beyond the people initially involved in a dispute. The meaning of the case. The Willie Kimani case became much larger than a single criminal prosecution. It became part of Kenya's broader conversation about police accountability and human rights. It demonstrated why independent investigations matter. It demonstrated why evidence matters. And it demonstrated why the presumption of innocence and the burden of proof must remain central to criminal justice. The final outcome was not the same for every accused person. 4 were convicted, 1 was acquitted. That distinction is important because justice is not simply about obtaining convictions. It is about reaching conclusions based on evidence and applying the law fairly. Years later, time can create distance from a tragedy. New headlines appear, new cases dominate the news, people move on. But for the families involved, the passage of time does not erase the loss. There is no verdict that can bring back a loved one. No sentence can restore the years that were taken away, and no court judgment can completely answer the emotional questions that families carry after a violent death. What the justice system can do is establish responsibility where the evidence supports it, and in this case, after years of proceedings, the court did exactly that for 4 of the accused. Perhaps the most important way to end the story is not with the accused, it is with the victims: Willie Kimani, Josephat Mwenda, Joseph Muiruri. 3 names, 3 lives, 3 families, and one case that changed the national conversation about accountability. Their story is a reminder that behind every criminal case is a human story. There are people who leave home expecting to return. There are families waiting for a phone call. There are ordinary moments that nobody realizes will be the last, and there are questions that can remain with families for years. Final reflection. The Willie Kimani case began with a lawyer representing a client. It ended with convictions, prison sentences, and a death sentence. But between those 2 points was a story of disappearance, investigation, grief, and a long search for accountability. The case reminds us that justice can take years. Sometimes it comes slowly, sometimes it comes imperfectly, and sometimes, even after a verdict, the pain remains. But remembering the victims ensures that their lives are not reduced to the circumstances of their deaths. Willie Kimani was more than a murder victim. Josephat Mwenda was more than a name in a court file. Joseph Muiruri was more than the taxi driver who happened to be with them. They were people, and their story deserves to be remembered that way. This was the story of Willie Kimani, Josephat Mwenda, and Joseph Muiruri, 3 men who left court and never came home. End.